Let me tell you something that might change everything you think you know about getting an avoidant to come back. They don't come back because you waited. They come back because you stopped. You stopped chasing. You stopped convincing. You stopped trying to be enough. Here's the truth: avoidants are wired to pull away when emotions run high. The more you try to prove your love, explain your pain, or show them what they're losing, the more they feel cornered. Their nervous system isn't calibrated to intimacy the way yours might be. So what actually worked? Avoidants don't respond to pressure. They respond to peace. That single truth can change how you approach everything about a relationship with someone who has an avoidant attachment style. You see, avoidants are not wired to move toward intensity. They don't lean into emotion like anxiously attached individuals often do. They lean out the moment they sense someone wants too much, needs too much, or is trying to pull them too close. Their nervous system hits overload. And when that happens, they don't communicate. They don't seek clarity. They retreat. Silence becomes their shield. Distance becomes their protection. And suddenly, you're left wondering why they've gone cold after things seem to be going well. Now, here's the mistake most people make: they chase. They try harder. They explain, plead, ask for answers, or try to rekindle the emotional fire that was just extinguished. And what does that do? It creates pressure. It confirms every fear the avoidant already has. That closeness is a trap, that vulnerability will cost them, and that connection demands more than they're emotionally equipped to give. Avoidants aren't trying to hurt you when they pull away. They're trying to survive emotionally. And when you apply pressure, even if it comes from a place of love or fear, it doesn't feel like closeness to them. It feels like suffocation. So they run. But peace, that's a completely different experience. Peace is space without punishment. It's your ability to let go without hostility, to stop chasing without starting a war, to show them that their retreat isn't a signal for emotional chaos. When you respond with calm detachment instead of desperation, that's when they start to notice. Because peace doesn't trigger their defenses. Peace gives them time to think, and more importantly, to feel. When the noise dies down, when the texts stop flooding in, when the pressure disappears, that's when something powerful happens. They're finally able to reflect on you, the relationship, and the emotional security you offered. When you're not trying to fix, force, or convince, you're giving the avoidant something they've never truly known in relationships: safety. Safety in knowing they won't be smothered. Safety in knowing they can have space without rejection. And ironically, it's in that space of peace where they're most likely to remember what they miss. It's not the intensity. It's the stability, the calm, the way your presence didn't demand anything but still felt warm and grounding. This is why walking away with grace, not anger, is so powerful. It tells the avoidant, I'm not here to chase you, punish you, or fix you. I'm here to honor myself. That kind of emotional regulation, it's magnetic because it shows you're safe. And safety is the first step toward connection, especially with someone who's terrified of it. You walked away, and this time you meant it. That's the turning point. Not when you said you were done and secretly hoped they'd come chasing after you. Not when you pulled away as a tactic, checking your phone every hour to see if they noticed. No, this was different. This was when your energy shifted. This was when you realized that staying in a one-sided emotional cycle was costing you more than it was ever giving you. And you chose to break the pattern, not to manipulate them, but to protect yourself. When someone has an avoidant attachment style, they're used to people chasing after them. They're used to second chances, to endless explanations, to being the one in control of the emotional rhythm of the relationship. They expect you to hold on, to wait, to reach out even when they push you away. So when you finally walked away and didn't look back, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity, it shook them. Because this time, you weren't making a statement, you were making a decision. You didn't storm out hoping to be followed. You exited quietly, powerfully, and with self-respect. You didn't beg them to understand your worth. You simply stopped offering it where it wasn't valued. Avoidants are often deeply uncomfortable with emotional intensity, but what really unsettles them is emotional finality. When someone lets go for real, not as a performance, but as an act of true self-honoring. And when you did that, you created a silence that wasn't empty. It was full of meaning. They could feel the difference. This wasn't the silence of a game. This was the silence of a door closing with dignity. And here's what that does. It gives them space to feel something they've been avoiding: loss. Avoidants tend to minimize feelings, detach quickly, and avoid vulnerability. But when they realize the emotional tether is gone, something shifts. They start to sit with their own thoughts. They start to question what they walked away from. And that's the moment they start seeing what they couldn't before: your value, your presence, your consistency. It's not that you became more desirable. It's that your absence highlighted what they no longer have access to. You're no longer emotionally available to them. You're no longer sending energy their way. And now, for once, they're the one sitting in uncertainty. But that's not why you walked away. You didn't do it for a reaction. You did it because your self-worth finally spoke louder than your fear of losing them. You realized love isn't proven by how much you endure. It's protected by how much you respect yourself. When you walked away and meant it, everything changed. Not just for them, but for you. You stopped being the person who begged to be chosen. You became the person who chooses themselves. And in that choice, you reclaimed your power. You rebuilt your identity without them. And that changed everything. Because when you're in a relationship with someone who has an avoidant attachment style, especially one where you're constantly trying to prove your worth, it's easy to lose yourself. It's easy to start shrinking to fit their comfort zone. You stop expressing your needs. You walk on eggshells. You twist yourself into emotional shapes just to avoid triggering their withdrawal. And over time, your identity becomes centered around one thing: keeping the connection alive. But when the relationship finally ends, there's a moment of truth, a reckoning. You're left with the silence, the space, and the emotional wreckage. And that's when you face the most painful question: who am I without them? In the beginning, it's disorienting because so much of your identity was wrapped around the relationship, the role you played, the validation you craved, the hope that if you just did enough, said the right things, stayed patient long enough, they'd finally choose you fully. But they didn't. And in that loss, you had a choice to keep defining yourself by their inability to love you properly, or to start rebuilding from the inside out. And you chose you. You stopped chasing closure from someone who was never emotionally available in the first place. You stopped replaying old conversations in your head. You stopped looking for meaning in their mixed signals and started creating meaning in your own life. You began doing things that had nothing to do with them. You rediscovered hobbies, passions, people, and routines that didn't revolve around waiting for a text back. You started healing, not by replacing them with someone new, but by reconnecting with the parts of yourself that got buried in the relationship. And as you rebuilt, your energy changed. You stopped needing validation. You stopped checking their social media. You stopped romanticizing the version of them you created in your mind and started accepting the reality of who they really were. Here's the thing. Avoidants notice that shift. Maybe not right away, but they feel it. Because when they come back, they're expecting to find you where they left you. Emotionally available, hopeful, maybe still hurting. But instead, they find someone who no longer makes them the center of their emotional universe. Someone who's grounded, calm, confident. Someone who doesn't flinch at their silence or crave their attention. Someone who grew. You didn't rebuild your identity out of bitterness. You did it out of necessity, out of self-love, out of survival. And the version of you that came out of that process, That version doesn't chase anymore. That version doesn't settle. That version knows love should feel like freedom, not fear. Like peace, not pressure. So yes, you rebuilt your identity without them. And in doing so, you stopped orbiting their emotional availability. You became whole on your own. And that's what they didn't expect. That's what they couldn't ignore. But your silence spoke louder than words, not because it was a tactic, but because it was the first time you chose peace over proving a point. With someone who has an avoidant attachment style, silence can be a trigger. But here's the twist. Not all silence is created equal. There's the silence that manipulates, and then there's the silence that heals. And what you did, that was healing silence. That was the moment you stopped explaining, justifying, begging to be seen. You didn't ghost them. You didn't punish them. You just disengaged with clarity, with grace. See, when you're in love with an avoidant, you often spend the relationship trying to fill in the emotional gaps, over-communicating, over-functioning, trying to pull more connection out of someone who resists closeness. And every time they pull away, you talk more, text more, push harder. Because deep down, you believe that if you could just say the right thing, they'd finally understand how much you care and give that care back. But they don't respond to intensity. They respond to space. And when you finally went silent, not as a punishment, but as an act of self-preservation, it shifted the entire dynamic. Your silence forced them to feel something they had been avoiding, the weight of their own decisions. When you stopped reaching out, they had no distraction from the emotional consequences of pulling away. No one was cushioning the impact anymore. And in that quiet, they had to sit with the discomfort they usually avoid. The reality that you were no longer there to emotionally babysit their detachment. And it wasn't just about the absence of noise. It was the energy behind it. Your silence wasn't laced with bitterness. It wasn't screaming, "I hope you notice me." It was steady, strong. It was the sound of boundaries taking root. It was the vibration of someone who finally understood their value and no longer needed to argue for it. That's what caught their attention, because avoidants aren't moved by pleading. They're moved by contrast. When you suddenly stop being the person who always reached out, always initiated, always held the emotional weight, you changed the rhythm, and they felt the shift. You weren't angry, you weren't waiting. You were just done. And ironically, that silence is what started the conversation in their head. That's when they began to question. Did I lose something good? Why haven't they checked in? Have they moved on? And for once, they were the ones sitting in uncertainty. You didn't say a word, but your silence delivered the message louder than any speech ever could. I no longer need to explain my worth. If you don't see it, that's your loss, not mine. That silence, that's what turned the tables, because it wasn't empty, it was full of power. It wasn't about giving up on them. It was about finally choosing you. They felt safe to miss you, not blamed by you. That right there is the emotional shift that made all the difference. Because people with avoidant attachment don't process emotions the same way others do. When they feel blamed, cornered, or emotionally overwhelmed, they don't lean in. They shut down. They emotionally disconnect, retreat, and find ways to justify their distance. And the more you try to get them to see how they hurt you, the more they bury themselves in defensiveness. Not because they don't care, but because their nervous system interprets emotional confrontation as danger, not connection. That's why so many people miss the mark after a breakup with an avoidant partner. They pour out messages, explanations, long emotional texts, hoping that if they just make them understand, the avoidant will wake up and come back. But here's the truth. Blame doesn't open a door. It builds a wall, especially with someone who's wired to interpret intimacy as pressure. But when you step back and chose peace over punishment, everything shifted. You didn't try to make them feel bad for walking away. You didn't chase them down to prove a point. You didn't lash out in anger or wrap your pain in guilt trips. You allowed space, and more importantly, you held it without resentment. That's what made the difference. That's what created the safety they'd never felt before. Because here's the thing, avoidants do miss people, but they can only access that sense of longing when they're not emotionally on the defense. When you let go without trying to teach them a lesson, you disarmed their entire system. You showed them that love doesn't always come with conditions, ultimatums, or explosions. That kind of maturity, that emotional regulation is rare, and they felt it. In the quiet, in the space you gave them, something unexpected happened. They finally had room to feel you. Not your pain, not your blame, not your expectations. You. Your presence, but your consistency, your emotional stability. The very things they couldn't fully appreciate when they were in survival mode. They started to remember once the pressure was off. You weren't yelling, "Look what you lost!" You were simply gone. Not in a cruel way, in a grounded, powerful way. And instead of associating you with guilt and overwhelm, they started associating you with peace and safety. That's what made you different. That's what made you unforgettable. People remember how you made them feel. And when someone has avoidant tendencies, they will never feel safe to miss a person who left them drowning in blame. But they will start missing the one person who allowed them space to be imperfect, without rage, without control, without shame. That's who you became. Not the one who begged to be loved, but the one who loved without needing to punish. And that's why, in their silence, in their processing, they felt something new of the freedom to miss you. You became the person they couldn't emotionally manipulate anymore. And that's when everything changed. Not because you were playing a game, not because you hardened your heart, but because you woke up. You finally saw the cycle for what it was, a loop of emotional highs and lows that always left you confused, depleted, and wondering what more you had to do to be enough. With someone who has avoidant tendencies, emotional manipulation doesn't always come in the form of cruelty or control. It's more subtle. It's the mixed signals, the hot and cold behavior, the way they draw you close and then disappear. It's how they avoid responsibility while making you feel like the problem. They don't ask for more, but they flinch when you pull away. They don't say they need you, but they get just close enough to keep you holding on. And for a while, you fell for it, not because you were weak, but because you loved them, because you believed their moments of connection were real, because you saw their potential and thought if you were patient enough, consistent enough, loving enough, they'd finally let down their guard. So you overextended. You tried to be easygoing, undemanding, supportive, even when your own emotional needs were being ignored. But over time, you started to see the pattern, how every time you got close, they'd sabotage it, how they used your empathy against you, deflecting accountability and making you question your own feelings. And the worst part, how they made you feel like the one who was too much, too emotional, too needy, too sensitive. That's when something inside you snapped, in the best way possible. You stopped explaining your worth. You stopped negotiating for love. You stopped letting their inconsistency define your self-esteem. You didn't announce it. You just shifted. You got quiet. You started observing more than reacting. You stopped chasing answers that would never come. And in doing so, you became immovable. They noticed it, even if they didn't say it. The emotional levers they used to pull, they stopped working. The silence that used to drive you into panic, it didn't get a response this time. The vague promises and delayed affection, you didn't chase it anymore. You didn't beg. You didn't explain. You didn't flinch. That's when they lost control of the dynamic, because you stopped playing the role they had come to expect. You were no longer the one they could reel in when it was convenient. You became the person with boundaries, with clarity, with a self-respect so strong it couldn't be shaken by someone else's emotional confusion. And here's the truth. Emotional manipulation only works when someone needs the other person more than they need themselves. But when you came back home to you, when you started meeting your own needs, trusting your own voice, validating your own worth, the game ended. You broke the pattern, and you became the one they couldn't touch the same way ever again. Let me leave you with this. Avoidants don't come back to the person they left. They come back to the person who let them leave and didn't chase. They come back when you stop proving your worth and start protecting your peace. They come back when you've outgrown the old dynamic and you're no longer available for emotional crumbs. And maybe they come back to stay. Or maybe you've healed so much that when they do, you don't even want them anymore. But either way, you win. Because you didn't wait to be chosen. You chose yourself first.